The auction hall smelled of salt and old timber, a scent that clung to everything in the coastal town where Marina Torres had spent the last 6 months piecing together a life from fragments. She sat in the back row, her daughter Sofia pressed against her side, small fingers clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had seen better days. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a persistence that matched the nervous rhythm of Marina's heartbeat as she watched lot after lot disappear to bidders whose casual gestures represented sums she could barely comprehend. She had not come here expecting to win anything. The maritime salvage auction had been advertised in the local paper with the kind of language that suggested opportunity for those with capital and connections, neither of which Marina possessed. But the notice had mentioned derelict vessels, items of historical interest, and the phrase "as is, where is," which she had learned during her months of desperation, meant that nobody else wanted them either. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. Another message from her sister. Another reminder that sensible people did not sit in auction houses when they had $17 in their checking account and rent due in 8 days. Marina silenced it without reading beyond the preview. She had become skilled at filtering voices that told her what she already knew, that her situation was impossible, that her choices had led her here, that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. Sofia shifted beside her, tilting her head to whisper a question about when they would go home. Marina smoothed her daughter's hair, dark and fine like her own, and promised soon, knowing that soon had become the word she used most often to defer truths too complicated to explain to a 7-year-old. Home was currently a single room above a laundromat, where the rumble of industrial dryers shook the walls at all hours, and the smell of detergent had seeped so deeply into their belongings that Marina wondered if it would ever wash out. The auctioneer's voice carried across the room with practiced energy, moving through lots with a rhythm designed to maintain momentum. Marina found herself studying the other attendees, trying to understand what brought people to a place like this. Some wore the confident posture of dealers who knew value when they saw it. Others had the careful stillness of collectors pursuing specific obsessions. A few looked like her, present more out of curiosity than intention, filling time in lives that had grown unexpectedly empty. When Lot 47 was announced, the room's energy shifted subtly. The auctioneer's tone acquired an edge of amusement as he described a partially submerged vessel located in the harbor's restricted salvage zone. He read from notes that detailed its condition with bureaucratic precision, listing structural damage, marine growth, and an assessment that classified it as a navigational hazard scheduled for demolition if not claimed within 30 days. The photographs displayed on the screen showed something that barely resembled a ship at all, more like a dark outline breaking the water's surface, its hull encrusted with decades of accumulated sea life. The opening bid was set at $700, a figure so low that several people in the audience laughed, not with cruelty, but with the kind of recognition that comes from understanding when something has been thoroughly defeated by circumstance. No hands went up. The auctioneer repeated the amount, his voice taking on the practiced cadence of someone accustomed to silence. He dropped it to 500, then 300. Still nothing. Marina felt Sofia's grip tighten on her arm. Her daughter had been watching the screen with unusual focus, her face pressed close as though trying to make sense of the dark shape in the water. She tugged Marina's sleeve and pointed, her voice barely audible over the auctioneer's continued appeals. "It looks like the ship from my book." The book in question was a battered picture encyclopedia of ancient civilizations that Marina had found at a library sale for 50 cents. Sofia had claimed it immediately, drawn to illustrations of Roman aqueducts and Egyptian temples, with the fierce attachment children reserve for objects that open worlds they cannot yet fully articulate. Lately, she had fixated on a page about Byzantine trade routes, tracing the dotted lines across the Mediterranean with her finger, while Marina read aloud descriptions of ships that had carried silks, spices, and the wealth of empires. Marina glanced at the screen, trying to see what her daughter saw. The vessel's profile was too degraded to distinguish specific features, but there was something in its proportions, in the way it listed to one side. That suggested it had been built for a different era entirely. The auctioneer was preparing to move on, his hand already reaching for the next lot's paperwork. Before Marina understood what she was doing, her own hand rose. Not high, not with confidence, but enough. The room's attention shifted toward her, a few heads turning with expressions that ranged from surprise to pity. The auctioneer paused, squinting toward the back row, as though uncertain he had seen correctly. He asked if she was bidding on lot 47, and Marina heard herself confirm it, her voice sounding strange and distant, as though someone else were speaking through her. $700 was more than she had, more than she could explain, more than any rational person would commit to an object they had never seen beyond a grainy photograph. Yet the number settled into her mind with unexpected clarity. She had a credit card with a limit she had been saving for true emergencies, the kind where Sofia needed medicine or the car refused to start. This was neither of those things. This was something else, a decision made not through calculation, but through an instinct she had learned to distrust during the months since her life had fractured. The auctioneer declared the lot sold, his gavel coming down with a sound that felt final in ways Marina was not yet ready to confront. Paperwork was thrust into her hands, documents requiring signatures and acknowledgments of terms she barely skimmed. The vessel was hers, along with all responsibilities for its removal, its debts, and any consequences of its continued existence in municipal waters. She signed where indicated, her handwriting shaky, aware that she had just purchased a problem she could not solve with resources she did not have. As they left the auction hall, Sofia's excitement was immediate and unguarded. She clutched the paperwork Marina had been given, examining the photographs with an intensity that made Marina's chest tighten with equal parts love and fear. Her daughter saw adventure, where Marina saw only another weight added to a burden already too heavy to carry. They walked to the car in silence, Marina's mind spinning through calculations that refused to resolve into anything resembling sense. The drive back to their room took them along the harbor road, where the water stretched dark and restless under gathering clouds. Sofia pressed her face against the window, searching for any glimpse of the ship Marina had just claimed. Marina kept her eyes on the road, unwilling to look at what she had done, afraid that seeing it would make the reality too sharp to bear. Their landlord was waiting on the stairs when they arrived, his expression carrying the particular weariness of someone who had delivered bad news too many times to find satisfaction in it anymore. He handed Marina an envelope without preamble, informing her that the building had been sold and that new management would be taking over at month's end. All tenants would need to reapply, which meant background checks, income verification, and deposits she knew she could not provide. He was not unkind about it, but kindness without solutions felt like a formality neither of them had time for. Marina thanked him mechanically and climbed the stairs with Sofia trailing behind. Both of them silent under the weight of what they had just learned. Inside the room, the walls seemed closer than they had that morning, the space contracting around them as possibilities narrowed further. Marina set the auction paperwork on the small table by the window and stared at it, wondering what impulse had convinced her that purchasing a derelict ship was anything other than the final proof of her own unraveling. That night, after Sofia had fallen asleep clutching her encyclopedia, Marina sat alone in the dim light of a single lamp and forced herself to read the documents thoroughly. The vessel was classified as a historical wreck of indeterminate age, its origins unclear due to lack of proper documentation. It had been raised partially during a harbor expansion project years earlier, then abandoned when the salvage company went bankrupt. Since then, it had remained half-submerged in a restricted zone, accumulating fines from the harbor authority and deteriorating under the patient assault of salt water and time. The paperwork included a notice that demolition crews were scheduled to arrive in 30 days unless the new owner provided proof of removal or restoration plans. Marina calculated the cost of hiring a salvage crew and felt her stomach twist. Even the cheapest estimates she found online were 10 times what she had paid for the ship itself. She had bought a countdown, nothing more. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her ex-husband, his message brief and cutting, asking if she had found work yet, reminding her that child support could not be paid in promises. Marina did not reply. There was nothing to say that would not sound like the same exhausted litany she had been repeating for months. She had been a paralegal once, good at her job, relied upon by attorneys who trusted her research and her attention to detail. Then the firm had downsized, and she had become part of a statistics, another casualty of efficiency gains that looked clean on a spreadsheet and devastating in lived experience. She had tried to rebuild quickly, applying to positions that paid less each week, adjusting her expectations downward until she was competing for jobs that teenagers took as summer work. But there was always someone younger, more desperate, more willing to accept conditions she could not. And then there was Sofia, whose school schedule did not align with shift work, whose occasional fevers meant missed hours Marina could not afford to lose, whose presence was a joy and a complication that no employer wanted to navigate. The months had blurred into a sequence of losses too consistent to feel dramatic. First the apartment, then the car she had relied on, then the small comforts she had once taken for granted. Coffee from a cafe instead of instant. New shoes when Sofia's feet grew. The ability to say yes without calculating the cost against a dwindling reserve that had reached its limit long before she was ready to admit it. Now she owned a ship. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it were not so perfectly aligned with the trajectory of her recent decisions. She thought about her sister's messages, the ones still waiting unread, and knew what they would say. That Marina was being reckless. That she needed to think about Sofia's stability. That hope without a plan was just denial dressed in optimism. All of it true, none of it helpful. Marina stood and walked to the window, looking out over the town's scattered lights toward the dark shape of the harbor. Somewhere out there, beneath water that would be cold and unforgiving, sat the thing she had just tied herself to. She did not know why she had done it. She did not know what she expected to find. She knew only that the act of raising her hand in that auction hall had felt like the first choice she had made in months that was hers alone, untethered from necessity or compromise. The thought offered no comfort, but it was something. And in a life that had been reduced to counting days until the next crisis, something felt almost sufficient to carry her into sleep. Morning came with the sound of rain against the window, steady and insistent. Marina woke with the kind of clarity that sometimes follows poor decisions, the mind's way of compensating for what the heart has already committed to. She knew she needed to see the ship, not in photographs, but in the unforgiving light of day, where its true condition could not be softened by distance or hope. Sofia was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the bed, with her encyclopedia open to the Byzantine page. She looked up when Marina stirred, her expression serious in the way children become when they sense adults are carrying weights too heavy to share. She asked if they could go see the ship today, and Marina heard in her daughter's voice not just excitement, but something deeper. A need to confirm that the thing her mother had done was real and not just another promise that would dissolve under scrutiny. They dressed in layers against the damp cold and walked to the harbor, a distance Marina would once have driven, but now covered on foot to save gas money. The rain had softened to mist by the time they reached the waterfront, where fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings and the smell of brine mixed with diesel and old wood. The Harbor Authority office was a squat building near the main pier, its exterior weathered by decades of salt spray and neglect. Inside, a clerk listened to Marina explain her situation with an expression that suggested he had heard similar stories before and knew how they usually ended. He pulled up the vessel's file on a computer that wheezed with age and confirmed what Marina already knew. The ship was located in the salvage zone, accessible only by boat, and currently scheduled for demolition. He handed her a map marking its location, along with a waiver she needed to sign acknowledging that she entered the restricted area at her own risk. Marina asked if there was any information about the ship's history, where it had come from, when it had sunk. The clerk scrolled through digital records, his face illuminated by the pale glow of the screen, and shook his head. The file went back only 20 years, to when the vessel had first been documented as a hazard. Before that, nothing. It had simply been there, waiting to be noticed. He warned her that the structure was unstable, that boarding it without proper equipment would be dangerous, that she should hire professionals if she intended to do anything beyond taking photographs from a safe distance. Marina thanked him and left with the map folded in her pocket, knowing she would not follow his advice, because following advice required resources she did not have. They walked along the pier until they reached a section where small rental boats were tied in neat rows. The owner was an older man with hands weathered by a lifetime of work on the water, his face creased in patterns that spoke of too much sun and not enough rest. Marina asked about renting a boat for an hour, and he named a price that made her hesitate before agreeing. It was money she could not spare, but turning back now felt like admitting defeat before she had even begun. The boat was small, with an outboard motor that coughed reluctantly before settling into a rough idle. The owner helped Sofia aboard, his movements gentle despite the size of his hands, and gave Marina brief instructions about steering and throttle control. He pointed toward the salvage zone, a section of the harbor marked by faded buoys, and told her to stay clear of the submerged sections where debris had accumulated over the years. Marina guided the boat away from the pier with Sofia seated in front of her, life jacket secured, despite her protests that she knew how to swim. The water was calmer than Marina had expected, its surface disturbed only by the wake of their passage and the occasional ripple from fish moving beneath. The town receded behind them, its buildings growing small and indistinct, while ahead the salvage zone opened like a graveyard of forgotten projects. She saw the ship before she fully understood what she was looking at. It rose from the water at an angle, its dark hull breached in several places, masts long since collapsed into tangled debris that floated nearby. Marine growth covered every surface, transforming what had once been wood and metal into something that looked almost geological, as though the sea were slowly digesting it, breaking it down into forms that could be reabsorbed into the ecosystem without memory or regret. Marina cut the engine and let the boat drift closer, her breath catching as the scale of the wreck became clear. This was not a small vessel. Even in its degraded state, it was larger than anything she had expected to claim for $700. The hull's curvature suggested a design meant for deep water, for voyages that extended beyond coastal routes. Parts of the deck were still visible above the waterline, their surfaces slick with algae and barnacles, while below, the water was dark enough to hide whatever remained submerged. Sofia leaned forward, her encyclopedia forgotten in her lap, eyes wide as she took in the reality of what they were seeing. She said it looked sad, and Marina found she could not disagree. There was something mournful about the wreck, a quality of abandonment that went beyond physical decay. It had been left to rot, not because it lacked value, but because retrieving that value would cost more than anyone was willing to pay. Marina secured the boat to a piece of exposed railing, testing it carefully before trusting it with their weight. She told Sofia to stay seated while she examined the structure more closely, moving along the tilted deck with hands outstretched for balance. The wood beneath her boots was spongy in places, treacherous, threatening to give way without warning. She stepped carefully, listening to the creaks and groans of a hull that had been compromised in too many ways to count. Near what must have once been the center of the deck, a section of planking had collapsed entirely, revealing a dark opening that led into the ship's interior. Marina knelt at its edge, peering down into shadows that her eyes could not penetrate. The smell that rose from below was thick with rot and stagnant water, but underneath it was something else, a scent she could not quite identify, dry and faintly sweet, like old parchment or incense left too long in a closed space. She stood and returned to the boat, where Sofia was tracing the ship's outline with her finger against the backdrop of the harbor. Her daughter asked if they could explore inside, and Marina felt the automatic refusal form before something made her pause. They had come this far. They had spent money they could not afford on a boat rental and a ship that was probably worthless. Turning back without seeing what lay below felt like another in a long series of compromises that had left her life smaller than it needed to be. She retrieved a flashlight from the emergency kit in the boat, tested its beam against her palm, and told Sofia they would look quickly, just a glance, nothing more. The lie tasted familiar. She had become accustomed to telling Sofia that things would only take a moment, that they would be careful, that there was nothing to worry about. Each time, the promises grew thinner, worn down by repetition until they were more reflex than truth. They climbed back onto the deck together, Marina gripping Sofia's hand tightly as they moved toward the collapsed section. The opening was narrow enough that they had to descend one at a time, Marina going first to test the stability of whatever lay below. The ladder she found was rusted but intact, its rungs cold and slick beneath her palms. She called up to Sofia to follow slowly, to stop if anything felt wrong, knowing even as she spoke that her daughter would follow regardless, because that was what they did now. They moved forward together, navigating spaces that should have been off-limits, because the alternative was standing still in a life that had already proven it would not wait for them to be ready. The interior of the ship was darker than Marina had anticipated, the flashlight beam cutting only shallow paths through air that felt thick and resistant. Water sloshed somewhere below, its movement creating sounds that echoed in ways that made it impossible to judge distance or depth. The space they entered was cramped, its ceiling low enough that Marina had to crouch, and the walls were lined with what appeared to be storage compartments, most of them broken open, their contents long since claimed by water or time. Sofia stayed close, one hand gripping the back of Marina's jacket, her breathing quick but steady. They moved forward slowly, the flashlight revealing fragments of a space that had once served purposes Marina could only guess at. Sections of rope hung from beams overhead, stiff with salt and age. Metal fittings protruded from walls at odd angles, their original functions obscured by corrosion. Everything felt temporary, as though the structure were held together by nothing more than habit, waiting for the right moment to finally collapse. They reached a junction where the passage split, one branch leading deeper into the hull, the other angling upward toward what might have been crew quarters. Marina chose the upward path instinctively, unwilling to descend further into water she could hear but not see. The angle of the floor forced them to brace themselves against the walls, and more than once, Marina felt the wood shift beneath her weight, creaking in protest. The passage opened into a small chamber that looked as though it had been used for storage. Shelving lined one wall, though most of the shelves had collapsed, spilling their contents across the floor in heaps that had fused together over time. Marina swept the flashlight across the debris, cataloging what she could see. Fragments of pottery, so degraded they crumbled at a glance. Pieces of metal that might have been tools or utensils, their shapes no longer recognizable. And scattered among the ruin, darker objects that caught the light differently, their surfaces smooth despite the surrounding decay. She knelt and picked up one of these objects, brushing away layers of sediment with her thumb. It was heavier than she expected, and as the dirt came away, she realized she was holding something carved. The details were difficult to make out in the flashlight's narrow beam, but she could feel them under her fingers. Lines that formed patterns, shapes that suggested deliberate artistry rather than random wear. Sofia crouched beside her, pointing to another similar object half buried in the debris. Marina retrieved it carefully, her pulse quickening as she examined its surface. This one was clearer, less damaged by time. It appeared to be a small panel, rectangular, with an image etched or painted onto its face. The colors had faded, but traces remained. Gold, deep blue, a red that had darkened to near black. She did not recognize what she was looking at, not immediately. But something in the formality of the composition, in the way the figure at its center was rendered with hands raised in a gesture she had seen before in museums she could no longer afford to visit, made her hands tremble. She set the flashlight on the floor, angling it to illuminate both objects, and forced herself to breathe slowly, to think clearly, to resist the rising surge of something that felt too much like hope. Sofia whispered that they looked like the pictures in her book, the ones from the Byzantine section, and Marina felt the words land with a weight that had nothing to do with their simplicity. She had not allowed herself to believe that the ship could be anything more than what it appeared. But here, in her hands, were objects that did not belong in a wreck left to rot. They belonged in climate-controlled cases, behind glass, labeled with text that explained their origin and their value. She stood slowly, the two panels clutched against her chest, and swept the flashlight across the chamber again. Now that she knew what to look for, she began to see them everywhere. Dozens, perhaps more, scattered among the debris or still affixed to the shelves that had not yet collapsed. Some were intact, others broken into fragments, but all of them bore the same careful craftsmanship, the same faded colors that spoke of a time when such objects had been created not for commerce, but for devotion. Marina's mind raced, trying to calculate what this meant, what she had stumbled into. Icons, Byzantine religious panels, the kind that appeared in auction catalogs with prices she had only ever read about in articles describing sales to collectors and museums. If even a fraction of what lay scattered in this chamber was authentic, she was not standing in a derelict ship. She was standing in something closer to a vault. The realization did not bring relief. It brought fear. Fear of being wrong, of misunderstanding what she was seeing, of allowing herself to believe in a reversal of fortune so complete that it felt like a story rather than a life she could actually claim. And beneath that fear was another, sharper concern. If these objects were valuable, then someone else must have known about them. Someone must have been looking. And if that was true, then she had just made herself visible in ways she wasn't prepared to defend. She told Sofia they needed to leave, her voice tight with urgency. They retraced their steps through the passage, moving faster now. Heedless of the sounds the structure made, as they disturbed its fragile equilibrium. The climb back to the deck felt longer than the descent, and when they finally emerged into open air, Marina gulped it down, as though she had been drowning. The boat was still secured where she had left it, rocking gently in the wake of a passing vessel. She helped Sofia aboard, then cast one more look back at the dark opening they had just climbed from. The ship looked no different than it had an hour earlier, but everything had changed. She had come here expecting to confront a mistake. Instead, she had found a question whose answer could reshape everything, or destroy what little remained. As she started the engine and guided the boat back toward the pier, the two panels wrapped carefully in her jacket. Marina felt the full weight of what lay ahead settle onto her shoulders. She would need to have the objects authenticated. She would need to understand what rights she had to claim them. She would need to navigate a process she knew nothing about, with resources she still did not possess, all while keeping Sofia safe and keeping them both housed long enough to see this through. The shore drew closer, its lights beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. Behind them, the wreck receded into shadow, holding its secrets a little while longer. Marina did not look back. She could not afford to. The only direction that mattered now was forward, into a future that had suddenly become both terrifying and impossible to ignore. The authentication process began not with triumph, but with humiliation. Marina had carried the two panels wrapped in a borrowed towel to the town's small historical society, a building that occupied what had once been a customs house during the harbor's more prosperous days. The woman behind the desk had listened to Marina's explanation with the kind of patient skepticism reserved for people who arrive with objects they believe are treasures, but are usually just well-preserved junk. She had examined the panels briefly under a desk lamp, turning them over in hands that moved with practiced efficiency, and then informed Marina that while they were certainly old, authenticity would require evaluation by specialists the society did not employ. She had written down the names of 3 appraisers, all located in cities Marina could not afford to reach, and suggested that Marina might want to clean the pieces more thoroughly before seeking professional opinions. The advice had been delivered kindly, but Marina heard beneath it the unspoken assumption that she was wasting everyone's time. The drive back to their room had been silent except for Sofia's questions about what the woman had said, whether the panels were real, whether they were valuable. Marina had answered in fragments, unwilling to extinguish her daughter's hope, but unable to feed her own. That night, she had sat at the small table under the lamp's harsh light and photographed the panels from every angle, trying to capture details her eyes might have missed. The images looked worse on her phone's screen than they did in person, the colors muddied, the craftsmanship obscured by shadows and poor resolution. She posted them to an online forum dedicated to antiques and historical artifacts, typing out her story with the self-consciousness of someone who knows they sound desperate. The responses arrived quickly, a mix of genuine curiosity and thinly veiled condescension. Several users pointed out that Byzantine-style reproductions had been popular in the 19th century, that many such pieces had been created for the tourist trade when Mediterranean travel became fashionable among wealthy Europeans. Others asked questions she could not answer about provenance, about how the ship had come to be in that particular harbor, about documentation that would prove the panel's journey from their creation to her hands. One user, whose profile suggested academic credentials in medieval art, had sent a private message asking for higher resolution images and offering to consult with colleagues if Marina could provide them. The message had been professional, but cautious, establishing boundaries even as it extended a tentative offer of help. Marina had replied immediately, explaining that she lacked the equipment for better photographs, but would try to arrange something. The user had not responded again. Days passed in a rhythm that felt both urgent and stalled. Marina spent hours at the public library, using their computers to research Byzantine iconography, learning terms like tempera and gesso, studying images of authenticated pieces in museum collections. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that what she had found was real. But conviction without proof was just another form of hope. And hope had become a currency she could no longer afford to spend recklessly. Her sister called on the fourth day, her voice tight with frustration barely contained. She had heard from someone who had heard from someone else that Marina had bought a boat, which was not true, but close enough to the truth that Marina did not bother correcting it. The conversation deteriorated quickly into familiar accusations, that Marina was being irresponsible, that Sofia deserved stability, not a mother chasing fantasies, that their parents would be ashamed if they were still alive to witness how far Marina had fallen. Marina had listened without defending herself, knowing that anything she said would only provide more ammunition. When her sister finally paused for breath, Marina had asked if she could borrow money for a professional appraisal, explaining in broad terms what she had found. The silence that followed had been long enough that Marina thought the call had dropped. Then her sister had laughed, not with humor, but with the bitter recognition of a pattern she had watched repeat itself too many times. She had told Marina that she could not keep enabling this behavior, that every time she helped, Marina only dug herself deeper into whatever delusion she was currently inhabiting. She had said that until Marina was ready to accept reality and make responsible choices, there was nothing she could do. The call had ended there, and Marina had stared at her phone for a long time afterward, feeling the distance between them widen into something that might never close. The mockery was not limited to family. Word had spread in the way small coastal towns specialized in, through networks of gossip that moved faster than official news. The clerk at the grocery store had asked about her treasure ship, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. A neighbor had stopped her on the stairs to say he had heard she was going into the salvage business, his tone making clear he thought it was a joke worth sharing. Even the librarian, who had always been kind, had asked gently if Marina was doing all right, if she needed information about social services or support groups. Each interaction carved away another piece of the resolve Marina was trying to build. She had expected skepticism from strangers, but the cumulative weight of dismissal from people she saw daily, people whose opinions should not have mattered, but somehow did, pressed down on her with a force that made it hard to breathe. She began to avoid eye contact when she left the building, taking routes that minimized encounters, timing her errands for hours when fewer people were likely to be around. Sofia felt it too. She came home from school one afternoon with red eyes she tried to hide, and when Marina pressed gently, she admitted that some of the other children had been making fun of her. They had said her mother was crazy, that she had bought a pirate ship, that they were going to lose their apartment and have to live on the boat. Sofia had defended Marina fiercely, she said, but the words had stayed with her, seeds of doubt planted by children who repeated what they heard at home. Marina held her daughter that night, feeling the smallness of her frame, the trust that still persisted, despite everything. She promised Sofia that things would get better, that the ship was real and important, that people just did not understand yet. The words felt hollow even as she spoke them, wishes dressed up as certainties. But Sofia had nodded against her shoulder and eventually fallen asleep, still holding on. The money situation grew more acute as the days passed. The auction house sent a reminder about fees associated with the vessel's transfer, including charges for documentation and administrative processing that Marina had not anticipated. The harbor authority followed with their own invoice for mooring fees retroactive to the date of purchase, along with a notice that failure to pay would result in immediate revocation of ownership and resumption of demolition proceedings. Marina laid out all the bills on the table one night after Sofia was asleep and tried to construct a path forward. The numbers did not cooperate. Even if she sold everything she owned, even if she found work that started immediately, she could not generate enough cash to meet the obligations now stacking up around her. The ship was not an asset. It was an accelerant, speeding her toward a collapse that might have taken months to arrive but would now come within weeks. She thought about walking away. The fantasy of surrender was seductive in its simplicity. She could stop paying the fees, let the harbor authority reclaim the wreck, return to the exhausting but familiar struggle of looking for work and stretching dollars until they screamed. No one would blame her. In fact, most people would probably respect the decision as a return to sanity. But walking away meant leaving the panels behind, along with whatever else might be hidden in that flooded hull. It meant accepting that the moment when her hand had risen in the auction hall had been a mistake, nothing more. And something in Marina rebelled against that conclusion with a stubbornness she did not fully understand. She had been told too many times in recent months what she could not do, where she did not belong, what she should accept as the limits of her life. The ship, regardless of whether it held treasure or just trash, represented a refusal to accept those limits without testing them first. She returned to the wreck 3 days later, this time alone. Sofia was at school, and Marina had called in sick to the part-time cleaning job she had taken on desperation 2 weeks earlier. The lie had come easily, too easily. And she knew she was burning bridges she might need later. But the urgency had become physical, a pressure in her chest that demanded action even when action seemed futile. The rental boat owner recognized her and quoted a lower price, perhaps out of pity, or perhaps because he understood that repeat customers in his line of work were rare enough to deserve encouragement. She did not ask which. She took the boat, navigated back to the wreck, and boarded it with a determination that felt more like defiance than confidence. This time she came prepared. She had borrowed a better flashlight from the library's tool lending program, along with work gloves and a small crowbar she hoped would help her access compartments that had been sealed by swelling wood or corrosion. The descent into the ship's interior felt less frightening on the second visit, familiarity dulling the edge of unease, even as the risks remained unchanged. She went directly to the chamber, where she had found the first panels, moving with purpose through the tilted passages. The debris looked exactly as she had left it, untouched by anyone in the days since her initial discovery. That itself felt significant. If others had known about this, if the wreck had been anything other than forgotten, someone would have come. The fact that she was still alone suggested that whatever secrets the ship held, they had remained hidden until she had accidentally uncovered them. Marina began working systematically, using the crowbar to pry open storage compartments that had been jammed shut. Most yielded nothing of interest. Just rotted fabric and corroded metal, the mundane remains of a vessel's working life. But in the third compartment, she forced open. Her light caught on something that made her pause. More panels, these ones stacked with care, separated by what appeared to be layers of waxed cloth that had partially preserved them from the worst of the water damage. She extracted them one by one, laying them out on a relatively dry section of floor, 5 panels in total, each one larger than the first 2 she had found. The images were clearer here, protected by their storage. She could make out faces rendered in the formal frontal style she had learned to recognize from her research. Gold leaf that had survived in patches, catching her light and throwing it back in soft glints. Inscriptions in a script she could not read, but knew from photographs, was Greek. Her hands shook as she photographed each piece, trying to capture details that would be convincing to the experts she still hoped to reach. The act of documentation felt sacred and transgressive at once, as though she were both preserving history and violating it by her presence. She wrapped the panels carefully in plastic sheeting she had brought for this purpose and carried them up to the deck. making multiple trips until all 7 pieces were secured in the boat. The return journey felt longer than usual, the weight of what she carried pressing on her, not physically, but psychologically. She was removing artifacts from their resting place, assuming authority she did not technically have, acting on instincts that could be wrong. But leaving them to be demolished with the ship felt worse than any alternative she could imagine. Back in the room that night, with the panels arranged on every available surface, Marina took new photographs using the library's advice about natural lighting and neutral backgrounds. The results were better, clearer, enough that when she sent them to the academic who had messaged her before, she felt a flicker of hope that this time might yield a different response. The reply came 18 hours later, and it was not what she had expected. The academic had shared the images with colleagues, and their consensus was that the panels warranted serious investigation. They could not confirm authenticity from photographs alone, but several features suggested the pieces might be genuine Byzantine work from the Middle Period, somewhere between the 9th and 11th centuries. If that was true, and if the panels had been preserved well enough to survive proper conservation, their value could be significant. The message included a cautious warning. Objects like these, if authentic, often had complicated ownership histories. Marina would need to establish clear provenance, demonstrate that she had legal right to possess them, and navigate regulations regarding cultural artifacts that varied depending on the item's origins. The process would be complex, potentially expensive, and not guaranteed to result in her retaining ownership, even if she had purchased the vessel legally. Marina read the message 3 times, absorbing both its promise and its caution. The academic had also included contact information for a conservator who worked with religious art and might be willing to examine the panels in person if Marina could arrange transport. The conservator was located 4 hours away, in a city Marina had never visited, and the initial consultation fee was more than she currently had available. She set the phone down and looked at the panels again, trying to see them as the academic must have, as objects whose value transcended the immediate financial. These were windows into a world that had vanished 1,000 years ago, created by hands guided by faith and skill she could barely comprehend. The fact that they had survived at all felt miraculous. The fact that they had ended up in her possession felt like a responsibility she wasn't sure she was qualified to bear. The next day, Marina did something she had been avoiding. She called her ex-husband and asked if they could meet to discuss something important. His skepticism was immediate and audible, but he agreed, naming a coffee shop near the harbor where he sometimes worked on his laptop between the jobs that defined his own precarious existence. They had not spoken face-to-face in months, their interactions reduced to terse text messages about Sofia's schedule and missed support payments. When they sat down across from each other, Marina could see the question already forming behind his eyes. He asked if this was about money, and she told him honestly that it was not directly. She explained about the ship, about the panels, about the possibility that she had found something that could change their circumstances if she could just navigate the next few weeks without losing everything. His reaction was complicated. She could see him cycling through responses, wanting to dismiss her as he had learned to do during their marriage, when her ambitions did not align with his sense of practical reality, but also unable to completely ignore the evidence she showed him on her phone. The photographs were compelling in ways her words were not, and he spent a long time scrolling through them in silence. Finally, he asked what she needed. Marina had not expected the question to be asked so directly, and it took her a moment to formulate an answer. She needed time, she said. Time to get the panels authenticated. Time to understand what she had. Time to make decisions that were not forced by immediate crisis. If he could help with Sofia for a few days, if he could cover some of the immediate expenses she was juggling, she would pay him back as soon as she was able. He did not commit, but he did not refuse either. He said he would think about it, which was more than she had hoped for when she had made the call. They parted awkwardly, the weight of their failed marriage still present between them, but no longer the only thing that defined their interaction. Marina walked away feeling something she had not felt in months, a tentative sense that she might not be completely alone in this. That evening, she received a message from the conservator the academic had recommended. The woman had seen the photographs and was interested enough to propose an arrangement. If Marina could bring the panels to her, she would waive the consultation fee in exchange for the opportunity to study them in detail. The offer came with conditions. Any conclusions would be preliminary until more extensive testing could be conducted, and Marina would need to sign agreements protecting the conservator from liability if the pieces proved to be reproductions, or if ownership issues emerged later. Marina accepted immediately, before she could reconsider, before the practical obstacles could overwhelm the opportunity. She borrowed a car from the rental boat owner, who had become something close to an ally through their repeated interactions, though neither of them had named it as such. She packed the panels with obsessive care, wrapping each one in layers of padding and securing them in boxes designed for shipping fragile items. The drive was long and nerve-wracking. Every bump in the road made her flinch. Every sharp turn brought visions of the boxes sliding and the panels shattering despite her precautions. Sofia sat beside her, sensing the importance of the journey, asking questions Marina could not fully answer because she did not yet know what the answers would be. The conservator's workshop was located in a converted warehouse, its exterior industrial and unremarkable, but inside it was a space of careful order. Workbenches lined with tools whose purposes Marina could only guess at. Walls hung with paintings in various stages of restoration. Light streaming through high windows that had been modified to filter harmful wavelengths. The conservator herself was younger than Marina had expected, perhaps 40, with hands that moved with a precision that suggested years of training and practice. She examined the first panel under magnification, her face neutral, revealing nothing of her assessment. Marina stood back with Sofia, trying not to hover, trying not to project her desperation onto the woman whose judgment would determine what came next. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken only by the soft sounds of tools against wood and the distant hum of climate control systems maintaining stable conditions. When the conservator finally spoke, her words were measured. The panel she was examining showed characteristics consistent with Byzantine craftsmanship from the Middle Period. The pigments appeared to be traditional formulations, egg tempera with natural mineral sources. The wood substrate had been prepared with gesso layers in a manner documented in period texts. The iconography followed established patterns for depictions of saints, with details that suggested the artist had been trained in one of the major production centers. She could not make a definitive attribution without further analysis, but her preliminary assessment was that the piece was likely authentic. If the other panels showed similar characteristics, Marina was in possession of a significant find. The conservator's tone remained professional, but Marina heard beneath it a note of excitement that the woman was trying to control. They spent the next 3 hours examining each panel in turn. The conservator photographed them extensively, took microscopic samples of pigment and wood fiber, measured dimensions and thicknesses, documented every detail with the thoroughness of someone who understood that such opportunities were rare. Marina watched, answering questions when she could, admitting ignorance when she could not, feeling the reality of what she had found, becoming more solid with each passing minute. By the time they finished, the light outside had shifted to late afternoon, and Marina felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The conservator printed preliminary findings on letterhead that made them look official, something Marina could show to authorities or potential buyers. or anyone who demanded proof that she was not simply delusional. The document was careful in its language, hedging against certainty. But its core message was clear. The panels warranted serious attention from institutions equipped to conduct full authentication. As Marina prepared to leave, the conservator asked about the ship, about where Marina had found the panels, about whether she had searched the entire vessel. Marina admitted she had explored only a fraction of it. That much of the hull remained submerged or inaccessible without equipment she did not have. The conservator's expression shifted, becoming more intent. She said that if there were more pieces, if the ship had been carrying a cargo of icons rather than just a few devotional items, the implications would extend far beyond monetary value. She asked if Marina would allow her to assemble a small team, experts who could properly document and extract whatever remained before the demolition took place. Marina hesitated, recognizing that accepting this help meant surrendering some control, meant inviting others into a discovery that had been hers alone. But she also recognized that she had reached the limit of what she could accomplish by herself. She agreed, and they exchanged contact information with the understanding that time was critical. The demolition was scheduled, and even if Marina could delay it, winter weather was approaching that would make the wreck increasingly dangerous to access. They had weeks at most, possibly less. The drive back felt different than the drive there. Sofia fell asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted by the day's tension. And Marina drove through gathering darkness with the conservator's documents resting on the seat beside her, like a promise that had not yet been fully articulated, but was no longer entirely abstract. When she reached the harbor town, the lights along the waterfront were beginning to glow, reflecting off water that moved with restless energy. Somewhere out there, the wreck waited in the darkness, its secrets no longer quite as buried as they had been that morning. Marina parked and sat for a moment, listening to Sofia breathe, feeling the magnitude of what was beginning to unfold settle around her like weather. She had entered the auction hall weeks ago with nothing but desperation and $17. Now she sat with documents suggesting she might have found something historians would study, something museums would compete to acquire, something that could reshape the trajectory of her life and her daughter's future. The gap between those two realities felt impossible to cross, and yet she had somehow stumbled onto a bridge that spanned it. But she also knew that the next phase would be more difficult than anything she had faced so far. Authentication was one thing, claiming ownership was another. Navigating the legal and bureaucratic systems that governed artifacts of historical significance would require resources and expertise she still did not possess. And all of it would have to happen while she continued managing the immediate crises that defined her daily existence. She woke Sofia gently, and they walked up to their room together, both of them too tired for conversation. That night, Marina lay awake long after her daughter had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine the future that might emerge from the chaos. She thought about the panels wrapped carefully in the next room, about the ship waiting in dark water, about the team that would soon arrive to document what remained. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something beyond fear and exhaustion. Not confidence. She was too familiar with how quickly hope could curdle into disappointment. But possibility. The sense that the story she had been living, the one where every choice led to smaller rooms and fewer options, might have a different ending than the one she had been bracing herself to accept. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying with it the smell of salt and the distant sound of waves against pilings. The harbor continued its ancient work, eroding and preserving, revealing and concealing, indifferent to the human dramas that unfolded along its edges. Marina closed her eyes and let the sounds carry her toward sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new complications, new doubts, new obstacles that would test whether the bridge she had found was solid enough to bear the weight of what she was beginning to hope for. The team arrived on a gray morning when the harbor was wrapped in fog so thick that the water and sky became indistinguishable. Marina met them at the pier, where 4 people emerged from a van with equipment cases that looked both expensive and essential. The conservator was there, along with 2 maritime archaeologists and a documentation specialist whose cameras hung from straps around his neck like armor. They moved with the quiet efficiency of professionals who had worked together before, unpacking gear and discussing logistics in shorthand that Marina could barely follow. She had spent the previous 2 days in a state of suspended anxiety, fielding calls from the harbor authority about overdue fees, dodging questions from neighbors who had heard that experts were coming, and trying to explain to Sofia why she needed to stay with her father for a few days while Marina dealt with grown-up business. Her daughter had clung to her at the handoff, sensing that something significant was happening, something that might change the careful balance of their small world. The lead archaeologist was a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, whose credentials Marina had looked up late one night in a spiral of insecurity and awe. She had excavated shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, published papers with titles Marina could barely understand, and testified before international tribunals about the repatriation of cultural artifacts. That someone of her stature had agreed to come to this forgotten harbor to examine Marina's discovery felt surreal in ways Marina was still processing. Dr. Chen approached Marina with a directness that bypassed small talk. She wanted to see the ship immediately, wanted to assess conditions before they committed resources to a full exploration. Marina led them to the rental boats, 2 of them this time, enough to carry the team and their equipment. The boat owner had been waiting, and he helped them load in silence, his weathered face revealing nothing of what he thought about the sudden influx of activities around a wreck that had been ignored for decades. The journey across the harbor felt different with others present. Marina had grown accustomed to approaching the ship alone or with Sofia, moving through a landscape that felt private despite its public location. Now, with the team discussing strategy and checking equipment, the wreck became something else. A site, a project, an object of professional scrutiny that demanded different protocols than her solitary explorations had required. When they reached the ship, Dr. Chen studied it for a long time before speaking. She walked the tilted deck with measured steps, examining structural damage, testing surfaces, occasionally consulting with the other archaeologist in tones too low for Marina to hear. Finally, she turned to Marina and asked how much of the interior she had explored. Marina described the route she had taken, the chambers she had entered, the areas that remained flooded or blocked by debris. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, then explained what would happen next. They would conduct a systematic survey, documenting everything before removing anything. They would assess structural integrity to ensure the wreck would not collapse during their work. They would catalog every artifact they found, photographing and measuring it in situ before extraction. The process would take days, possibly longer, depending on what they discovered. Marina was welcome to observe, but she would need to stay out of the way and follow their safety protocols without argument. Marina agreed to everything, grateful simply to be included. Aware that she was present on sufferance rather than expertise, she watched as they descended into the ship's interior with lights that turned the darkness into something almost clinical, sterile in its illumination. The passages she had navigated by flashlight now revealed details she had missed. Tool marks on beams, Roman numerals scratched into wood that indicated cargo placement, wear patterns that told stories of how the ship had been used. The first chamber yielded exactly what Marina had already found, nothing more. The team documented it methodically, photographing each panel from multiple angles, taking samples, making notes in tablets that recorded everything digitally. Marina stood at the threshold, watching them work, feeling oddly protective of space she had been the first to enter in perhaps a century. But it was when they moved deeper into sections Marina had not been able to reach that the true scale of the discovery began to emerge. One of the archaeologists found a sealed hatch beneath debris that had concealed it completely. The wood had swollen in its frame, requiring careful application of force to open without causing damage. When it finally gave way, the space beyond exhaled air that smelled different from the rest of the ship, drier, preserved by whatever accident of engineering had kept water from fully penetrating. Dr. Chen descended first, her light sweeping across a hold that had been designed for cargo. What it revealed made her stop so abruptly that the archaeologist behind her nearly collided with her. The hold was not empty. It was not even partially empty. It was packed with crates, their wood dark with age but intact, stacked with a precision that spoke of professional loading. And in the gaps between crates, visible through slats that had warped over time, were more panels. Dozens of them. Perhaps hundreds. The team worked in silence after that initial discovery, moving with a care that bordered on reverence. They opened the first crate with tools designed for archaeological work, documenting every stage of the process. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be silk that had degraded to gossamer fragility, were icons larger than anything Marina had found. Full triptychs with hinged panels. Standing pieces meant for altars. Works whose complexity and artistry were evident even to Marina's untrained eye. Dr. Chen's voice, when she finally spoke, was tight with controlled emotion. She said they needed to contact colleagues immediately, that what they were looking at was not just a collection of religious art, but possibly a treasury, the kind of cargo that would have been transported under guard during specific historical windows when such movement made sense. She began speculating aloud about dates, about the fall of Constantinople, about the Fourth Crusade, about periods when sacred objects had been displaced by political and religious upheaval. The documentation specialist was photographing continuously, his cameras clicking in rhythm with discoveries that emerged from every crate they opened. Some contained individual icons, others held collections of smaller devotional pieces, crosses, reliquaries, manuscripts illuminated with gold and precious pigments. The archaeologists worked with increasing urgency, aware that they had stumbled into something that exceeded their initial assumptions by an order of magnitude. Marina watched from the entrance to the hold, her body pressed against the frame, as though she needed its solidity to remain upright. She tried to calculate what she was seeing, tried to attach numbers to the objects emerging from centuries of darkness, but the scale defeated her attempts at comprehension. This was not 7 panels that might have value. This was a cargo hold filled with artifacts that belonged in the world's major museums. As the day wore on, the team's assessment grew more specific. Dr. Chen began making calls, speaking to colleagues in low, urgent tones that Marina could not fully hear, but whose intensity she could feel. When she finally emerged from the hold, her face was flushed with exertion and something else, a kind of professional awe that had overcome her initial caution. She told Marina they needed to stop, not because there was nothing left to find, but because what they had already documented required immediate intervention from authorities who could provide security and expertise beyond what their small team could offer. They had found evidence of approximately 300 individual pieces in the initial survey, with at least half the hold still unexplored. If the remaining crates held comparable contents, they were looking at one of the most significant discoveries of Byzantine art in modern history. Marina asked what that meant in practical terms, and Dr. Chen was silent for a long moment before answering. She said that valuation of such a collection was complex, that it depended on authenticity assessments, condition reports, provenance investigations, and market factors that varied wildly. But if even half the pieces proved to be authentic Byzantine work from the periods they suspected, and if Marina could establish legal ownership, the collection's value could easily exceed $500 million. Possibly more. The number landed without meaning at first, too large to process, too disconnected from Marina's lived experience of counting dollars and calculating how many days she could stretch a package of rice. Dr. Chen must have seen the incomprehension in Marina's face because she tried again, speaking more slowly. She said that individual icons from this period, when they appeared at auction, routinely sold for millions, that museums competed fiercely for pieces of this quality, that what Marina had found was not just valuable, but historically invaluable, a window into a world that had been documented but rarely preserved with such completeness. Marina felt her legs weaken and sat down abruptly on the deck, her back against the ship's cabin. Sofia's face appeared in her mind, along with the room above the laundromat, the overdue rent notices, the car she no longer owned, the job applications that had gone unanswered. The distance between those realities and what Dr. Chen was describing felt impossible to traverse, a gap too wide for any bridge. The team began packing their equipment as twilight approached, moving with quiet efficiency. Dr. Chen said they would return in the morning with additional specialists and security personnel. She warned Marina that what happened next would be complicated, that claiming ownership of cultural artifacts involved legal frameworks most people never encountered, that governments and institutions would have interests that might conflict with Marina's rights as the vessel's purchaser. But she also said, with a firmness that cut through Marina's growing panic, that Marina had done everything correctly so far. She had purchased the ship legally at public auction. She had documented her discoveries. She had sought expert consultation rather than trying to sell pieces privately. Those actions would matter when questions of ownership were adjudicated. Dr. Chen could not promise that Marina would retain everything, but she could promise that Marina's cooperation and transparency would be taken into account. That night, Marina sat alone in the room that had become too small to contain what was happening to her. She had retrieved Sofia from her ex-husband earlier, and her daughter was asleep now, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had traveled with them through every downsizing and displacement. Marina looked at her phone, at messages from her sister that she had not answered, at emails from the harbor authority about fees that now seemed almost comically insignificant. She thought about calling someone to share what she had learned, but there was no one who would believe her, no one whose reaction would not be colored by the months of skepticism and dismissal she had endured. The conservator had sent a message congratulating her and offering to help navigate what came next, but even that felt abstract, a kindness extended to someone who was still, despite everything, fundamentally alone in this. The next morning brought not just Dr. Chen's team, but others, a representative from the state's Cultural Heritage Office, an attorney specializing in maritime salvage law, an insurance assessor whose presence suggested that someone had already begun calculating liabilities and values. They gathered at the harbor office, filling a conference room that was rarely used, and Marina sat among them feeling both central and peripheral to the proceedings. The maritime lawyer explained the legal framework with a patience that suggested he had delivered similar explanations before, though perhaps never under quite these circumstances. The ship had been purchased legally, which gave Marina certain rights. However, cultural artifacts of historical significance were subject to regulations that superseded simple property ownership. The state had interest in preserving access to its cultural heritage. The federal government had treaties regarding items that might have been illegally exported from their countries of origin, and there were ethical considerations about whether objects of sacred significance should be privately owned at all. What this meant, he said, was that Marina's ownership would be challenged, not necessarily to deprive her of compensation, but to ensure that the proper processes were followed, that the artifacts were properly conserved, that their ultimate disposition served multiple interests rather than just her own. Marina listened. Understanding that what had seemed like a straightforward discovery, she had found valuable things on property she owned, was actually a complicated intersection of competing claims and frameworks. She asked what would happen to the icons, and the lawyer said that depended on many factors still being determined. Some might go to museums, some might be repatriated to Greece or Turkey if provenance suggested they had been taken illegally. Some might, after all other claims were settled, be sold at auction with Marina receiving proceeds. The timeline, he warned, would be measured in years, not months. The authentication alone would take time. Then there would be negotiations, possibly litigation, certainly bureaucratic processes that moved at their own pace, regardless of Marina's circumstances. In the meantime, the artifacts would be secured in climate-controlled facilities where they could be properly conserved and studied. Marina felt panic rising as she absorbed this information. Years. She had weeks before losing her housing, days before various creditors demanded payment, hours, it seemed, before the next crisis arrived. She asked what happened to her in the interim, how she was supposed to survive while lawyers and governments debated percentages of a fortune she had found, but could not touch. The attorney from the Cultural Heritage Office spoke then, her tone more sympathetic than bureaucratic. She said there were provisions for exactly this situation. Marina could apply for interim support drawn against her eventual compensation, essentially an advance on whatever settlement she would ultimately receive. The amount would be conservative, calculated to ensure it did not exceed her final claim, but it would be sufficient to stabilize her situation while the larger questions were resolved. There was paperwork, of course, forms that required notarization, agreements that Marina needed to sign acknowledging the state's interest in the artifacts, waivers of various rights she did not fully understand, but signed anyway because the alternative was continuing to fall while watching the life preserver float just out of reach. By the time the meeting ended, Marina's hand ached from signing documents, and her head throbbed with information she had only partially absorbed. But she had also been given a check, an interim payment that would cover several months of expenses while the formal processes ground forward. It wasn't life-changing money, not yet, but it was enough to stop the immediate bleeding, enough to let her breathe without calculating every dollar. The exploration of the ship continued over the following week, with Marina present for most of it, watching as crate after crate yielded treasures that made the team's excitement build to levels they could no longer contain professionally. The final inventory took 3 days to compile, requiring additional experts who flew in from universities and museums across the country. When Dr. Chen finally presented the preliminary assessment, her hands were shaking slightly as she held the document. 347 individual pieces had been catalogued. Of those, 312 showed characteristics consistent with Byzantine origin, spanning the 9th through 13th centuries. The remaining 35 were either too damaged to assess definitively or were later additions suggesting the collection had been accumulated over time rather than assembled at once. The pieces included major works, full iconostases meant for church altars, processional crosses made with techniques that had been documented but rarely survived, illuminated manuscripts whose texts added to scholarly understanding of liturgical practices. But they also included intimate devotional pieces, small icons meant for private worship, objects that connected the sacred to the domestic in ways that revealed how ordinary people had engaged with their faith. The total estimated value, calculated conservatively using recent auction results for comparable pieces, exceeded $700 million. Dr. Chen delivered this figure without drama, as a matter of professional assessment rather than revelation. But the number hung in the air like something that had weight and mass. Marina heard it and felt nothing at first, the amount too large to connect to her experience of money as something that bought groceries or paid rent. Then Sofia's face appeared in her mind, and she began to cry, not dramatically but quietly, tears running down her face, while the team politely looked away, giving her a privacy she had not asked for but desperately needed. Word spread quickly after that. The discovery made regional news first, then national, then international, as the historical significance became clear. Journalists called asking for interviews. Producers wanted to option the story for documentaries or films. People Marina had not heard from in years reached out with congratulations that felt hollow because they came only after success was confirmed. Her sister called, finally, her voice uncertain in ways it rarely was. She said she had seen the news, that she wanted to apologize for doubting Marina, that she had been trying to protect her, but understood now that she had only made things harder. Marina accepted the apology without dwelling on the months of isolation that had preceded it, choosing to believe that relationships could be rebuilt, even after trust had been tested past reasonable limits. Her ex-husband called too, his tone different from any conversation they had had since the divorce. He said he was proud of her, that Sofia had been telling everyone at school about her mother's discovery, that he wanted to help however he could going forward. Marina heard in his voice the same note of uncertainty that had colored her sister's call, the recognition that their previous assessments of her judgment had been wrong, that she had seen something they had missed. The mockery that had defined the previous weeks transformed into something else. The clerk at the grocery store, who had made jokes about her treasure ship, now asked genuine questions about the artifacts, about what would happen to them, about whether Marina planned to stay in town. The neighbor who had suggested she was delusional stopped her on the stairs to say he had been wrong, that he hoped there were no hard feelings. Marina accepted these reversals with a grace she did not entirely feel, understanding that people's opinions had never been the point. That vindication mattered less than the simple fact that she and Sofia were no longer trapped in a situation without exits. The months that followed were consumed by processes Marina had never imagined encountering. Depositions with lawyers representing various interests, meetings with museum curators who wanted to acquire specific pieces, negotiations with the Greek and Turkish governments about items whose provenance suggested they should be returned. Marina learned to navigate these conversations with help from advisors she could suddenly afford to hire, people whose expertise smoothed paths that would have been impassable alone. The final settlement took 14 months to resolve. In the end, Marina retained ownership of approximately 60% of the collection's value after various claims were settled. Some pieces went to museums as donations that generated tax benefits. Others were repatriated in exchange for Marina receiving international recognition for her cooperation with cultural heritage preservation. The remaining artifacts were sold at auction in a series of highly publicized sales that set multiple records. When the last check cleared, Marina found herself with resources that seemed fictional in their magnitude. $422 million after legal fees and taxes. More money than she could spend in a lifetime, more than Sofia would need for college, or anything else. More than made sense when she remembered sitting in an auction hall with $17 and no plan beyond the next week. She bought a house. Modest by the standards of people with comparable wealth, but luxurious in ways that still made her uncomfortable. It had a room for Sofia that was just hers, decorated according to preferences that changed weekly, as her daughter tested the novelty of choosing without constraint. It had a study where Marina kept the 2 panels she had retained from the collection, the first ones she had found, the pieces that had started everything. She established a foundation focused on supporting single mothers facing economic displacement, using her experience to shape programs that provided not just money, but the kind of comprehensive support she wished had existed when she needed it most. The work gave her purpose beyond managing wealth she had not expected to have, connecting her to people whose struggles she recognized intimately. Sofia thrived in ways that made Marina's chest ache with gratitude and relief. She attended a school where teachers knew her name, where her clothes were not marked by too many washings, where her future was not constrained by calculations about what could be afforded. She still carried the stuffed rabbit, though it now lived on a shelf in her room rather than traveling with her everywhere, a relic of a time that felt both recent and impossibly distant. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after the auction, Marina returned to the harbor. The wreck was gone, finally demolished after the artifacts had been removed, its presence erased from the water that had held it for so long. She stood at the pier where she had first rented a boat, looking out at smooth water that revealed nothing of what it had once concealed. The rental boat owner approached, moving with the same unhurried gait she remembered. He said he had been wondering when she would come back, that he had followed the news and was glad things had worked out the way they had. They talked for a while about nothing in particular, about weather and fishing and changes in the town that had accelerated after Marina's discovery brought attention to the harbor's history. Before she left, he told her something she had not known. He said that on the morning of the auction, he had been there too, thinking about bidding on the wreck himself. He had worked salvage before his boat rental business, knew something about ships, and had been curious about the vessel that had been sitting in the harbor for as long as he could remember. But when the bidding opened, he had hesitated, calculating the costs of removal and deciding the risk was not worth it. He said he was glad he had hesitated, glad Marina had been the one to raise her hand. Because someone needed to believe in what others had dismissed. Someone needed to look past the obvious decay to see what might lie beneath. And it had needed to be someone who understood what it meant to be overlooked, who knew intimately how easy it was to miss value hidden in plain sight. Marina thanked him and walked back toward her car, his words settling into her understanding of what had happened. The discovery had not been pure luck. It had required someone in the right position, with the right combination of desperation and hope, to see the ship as anything other than debris. She had been that someone not because she was special, but because her circumstances had stripped away the luxury of assumptions that kept others from looking closely at discarded things. As she drove home through the town that had witnessed both her lowest point and her transformation, Marina thought about the icons now scattered across museums and private collections worldwide. She thought about the scholars who would study them, about the visitors who would stand before them and see beauty without knowing the journey that had brought these pieces back into light. The story would be told and retold, probably, each telling simplifying the complexity into something more digestible. Woman buys ship, finds treasure, life changes. The formula was satisfying in its symmetry, and Marina did not begrudge people their narratives of sudden reversal. But she knew the truth was more complicated than any summary could capture. The discovery had not been a single moment, but an accumulation of choices made under pressure, each one leading to the next, without certainty of outcome. The transformation had not been instantaneous, but gradual, requiring her to learn how to inhabit a life she had not prepared for, to accept help she had been conditioned to refuse, to believe in possibilities that had been systematically dismissed by everyone around her. Most importantly, she had learned that value was not always visible, that what others discarded might contain more than they imagined, that persistence in the face of mockery and doubt was not stubbornness, but sometimes the only rational response to a world that measured worth too narrowly. That evening, She sat with Sofia at the dinner table in their new home, listening to her daughter describe a project about ancient civilizations she was working on for school. Sofia was using the encyclopedia, the same one that had led her to recognize the ship's profile in that auction hall photograph so long ago. The book was falling apart now, held together by tape and determination, but Sofia refused to replace it. Marina understood why. Some objects carried meaning beyond their utility, serving as reminders of moments when everything changed, when a choice made without full understanding led somewhere no one had expected. The encyclopedia was Sofia's version of the panels Marina kept in her study, proof that the life they now lived had grown from seeds planted in desperation and watered by hope that had no rational justification. As night settled over the house, Marina checked on Sofia one last time before bed. Her daughter was already asleep, the stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm, her face peaceful in ways it had not been during those months above the laundromat. Marina stood in the doorway, watching her breathe, feeling the full weight of what they had been given and what they had survived to reach this point. She thought about the ship, dissolved now into memory and documentation, its physical form reclaimed by whatever forces dealt with such things. She thought about the hands that had created the icons, about the voyage that had ended in the harbor, about the centuries the cargo had waited beneath water for someone to notice. And she thought about the version of herself who had walked into that auction hall with almost nothing, who had raised her hand despite every rational reason not to, who had chosen hope when hope seemed like the least responsible option available. That version of herself felt both familiar and distant now, a person she had been but no longer was, though the transition between the two remained impossible to locate precisely. Transformation, she had learned, was not a single moment, but a process that happened gradually enough that you only recognized it by looking back at where you had been. Marina closed Sofia's door gently and walked to her own room, where the two icons hung on the wall facing her bed. She looked at them in the dim light, at the faces rendered with devotion and skill that had survived a millennium. They looked back with the same patient regard they had offered in the darkness of the ship's hold, unchanged by their journey from sacred spaces to salt water to climate-controlled walls. She thought about the number, 704 million, that had defined the collection's value, about the 422 million that had become hers after settlements, about how those figures, enormous as they were, could not fully measure what had been found or what had been given, because the real treasure had not been in the cargo hold. It had been in the possibility itself, the proof that dismissal was not destiny, that value existed beyond what markets recognized, that a single choice made by someone with nothing to lose could cascade into transformations no one had predicted. Marina turned off the light and lay in darkness, listening to the house settle around her, feeling gratitude for things she could name and things she could not. Tomorrow would bring its own complications. There were always more decisions to make, more people needing answers she did not have, more opportunities and obligations that came with the resources she now commanded. But tonight, she allowed herself simply to rest in the knowledge that they were safe, that Sofia would wake to a future not constrained by what they lacked, that the desperate measures that had once defined their days had been replaced by choices made from abundance rather than scarcity. The ship was gone, the icons were scattered, but the story they told remained, written not just in documentation and news archives, but in the changed trajectory of two lives that had been heading toward disaster and were redirected by a moment of impulse too stubborn to be deterred by reason. Marina closed her eyes and let sleep come, knowing that whatever else the future held, she had already proven something that mattered more than any treasure. That courage did not require confidence, that hope was not foolishness, and that sometimes The most valuable thing you could do was refuse to accept what everyone else had already dismissed as worthless. The Foundation's offices occupied the top floor of a building overlooking the harbor, a choice Marina had made deliberately despite the higher cost. She wanted the women who came through the doors, seeking help to see the water, to be reminded that beneath ordinary surfaces, extraordinary possibilities could wait to be discovered. The space was furnished with comfortable chairs that did not match, donated by people who understood that dignity mattered more than aesthetics, and the walls held photographs of women who had passed through the program and agreed to share their stories. Marina spent 3 mornings a week there, meeting with applicants, reviewing cases, making decisions about disbursements that would have seemed impossibly large 2 years ago, but now felt measured and careful. Each woman who sat across from her desk carried a variation of the story Marina recognized in her bones. The job that disappeared without warning, the relationship that ended badly, the medical emergency that consumed savings, the cascade of small disasters that accumulated into crisis. She listened to them with an attention that went beyond professional courtesy, hearing in their voices the same mixture of shame and defiance she remembered from her own worst days. They apologized for needing help, explained their circumstances with defensive detail meant to prove they were not the kind of people who usually required assistance, promised they would pay back every dollar if given the chance. Marina interrupted these assurances gently, telling them that the Foundation did not require repayment, that accepting help was not failure, that their energy was better spent on moving forward than on justifying the past. One morning in late autumn, a woman arrived whose circumstances struck Marina with particular force. Her name was Rachel, and she was 34 years old with 2 children and a background in nursing that had been interrupted by an injury severe enough to end her career, but not severe enough to qualify for permanent disability. She had been living in her car for 3 weeks, parking in different locations each night to avoid attracting attention, sending her children to school with lunches assembled from food bank donations, and hoped that no one would notice the gaps in their stories. Rachel's voice was steady as she described her situation, but Marina saw her hands trembling in her lap, fingers twisting together in patterns that spoke of anxiety held barely in check. She had applied for every available assistance program, filled out forms until the words blurred, waited in offices where clerks processed her desperation with bureaucratic efficiency. She had been approved for some help, denied others, told repeatedly that she fell into categories that did not quite align with available resources. What she needed, she said, was enough money to secure an apartment, first month, last month, security deposit, and enough time to complete a certification program that would allow her to transition into medical coding, work she could do from home without the physical demands that had broken her body. She had calculated the amount precisely, down to the dollar, and the number she named was less than Marina spent on groceries in a month. Marina approved the request immediately, adding funds beyond what Rachel had asked for, because experience had taught her that people in crisis underestimated what they needed, that they shrank their requests to fit what they believed was reasonable rather than what was actually required. She also connected Rachel with one of the Foundation's partner organizations that provided career counseling and helped with job placement after certification. As Rachel left, her eyes wet with tears, she refused to let fall. Until she reached the elevator, Marina sat alone in her office and felt the familiar ache of recognition. 2 years separated her present from the version of herself who could have been sitting in Rachel's chair, but the distance felt simultaneously vast and negligible. The money had changed her circumstances absolutely, but it had not erased the memory of what those circumstances felt like, the weight of knowing that a single miscalculation could send everything crashing down. That afternoon, Marina drove to Sofia's school to pick her up, arriving early enough to watch through the fence as her daughter played with friends on the playground. Sofia had grown taller in the past year, her movements acquiring the gangly grace of approaching adolescence, and she navigated social dynamics with a confidence that still surprised Marina. There were no visible markers of the months they had spent above the laundromat, no signs that she had once measured her life in terms of what they could not afford. But occasionally, Sofia would do something that revealed the experience had left marks less obvious than scars. She hoarded snacks in her room, tucking away granola bars and crackers, even though the pantry was always full. She asked before using new school supplies, seeking permission even when it had already been granted. She watched Marina's face during conversations about money, scanning for signs of stress that would signal a return to the instability she remembered. Marina understood these behaviors as echoes of trauma that would take time to fade, if they ever faded completely. She did not try to correct them directly, instead working to build a foundation of security so consistent that eventually Sofia might believe in its permanence. They talked openly about the discovery now, about the auction and the ship and the icons, framing it as a story that belonged to both of them rather than something that had happened to Marina alone. Sofia had developed her own relationship with the discovery, one that centered on the historical aspects more than the financial. She had become fascinated by Byzantine history, reading everything she could find about the empire, its art, its trade routes, its eventual dissolution. Her room contained maps she had drawn herself, tracking the possible journey of the ship from its origin to its final resting place in their harbor. She speculated about the people who had loaded the cargo, about why they had been transporting such valuable items, about what circumstances had led to the ship's sinking. Marina encouraged this interest, grateful that Sofia could engage with the discovery as intellectual curiosity, rather than as the thing that had saved them from homelessness. It felt important that her daughter's relationship with the story be her own, not simply a reflection of Marina's experience. That evening, they had dinner with Marina's sister, the first time in months that their schedules had aligned. The relationship had been rebuilt slowly, conversation by conversation, through a process that required Marina to forgive without forgetting, and her sister to accept that her protection had sometimes looked indistinguishable from judgment. They did not talk about the months of silence often, but when they did, Marina's sister acknowledged that her fear of enabling bad decisions had prevented her from seeing when Marina had actually been making the only decision possible. Over pasta that Sofia had helped prepare, they talked about ordinary things: school projects, work frustrations, plans for the holidays. The conversation had a lightness that had been absent during years when every interaction carried the weight of Marina's unresolved crisis. Her sister asked about the foundation, and Marina described some of the cases she had been handling, careful not to reveal details that would violate privacy, but sharing enough to convey the scope of need she encountered daily. Her sister listened with genuine interest, then said something that surprised Marina. She said she had been wrong about more than just the ship. She had been wrong about Marina's judgment in general, assuming that desperation was the same as recklessness, that hope without guaranteed outcomes was foolishness. The discovery had forced her to reconsider those assumptions, to recognize that sometimes the most reasonable choice was the one that looked most irrational from the outside. Marina accepted the observation without dwelling on it, understanding that her sister was trying to articulate something she had probably been thinking about for a long time. The vindication mattered less now than the fact that they were sitting together, sharing a meal, rebuilding something that had almost been lost. After dinner, Sofia showed her aunt the maps she had been working on, explaining her theories about the ship's route, with the seriousness of someone presenting academic research. Marina's sister engaged with genuine interest, asking questions that prompted Sofia to elaborate, and Marina watched the interaction with gratitude for the ways people could grow and change when given reason and space to do so. Later that night, after Sofia was asleep and Marina was preparing for bed, she received an email from Dr. Chen. The archaeologist wrote periodically with updates about the artifacts, which had been dispersed to various institutions for conservation and display. This message contained photographs from an exhibition that had just opened at a museum in Athens, featuring icons from Marina's collection alongside pieces from the museum's permanent holdings. The installation was stunning. The icons arranged in a way that told a narrative about Byzantine devotional practices, about the movement of sacred objects across geography and time, about the ways faith had been expressed through art. Dr. Chen's email noted that the exhibition had drawn record crowds, that scholars were using the pieces to revise understandings of iconographic traditions, that Marina's discovery had generated research that would continue for decades. Marina studied the photographs, zooming in on individual pieces she recognized from her explorations of the ship. Seeing them displayed in proper context, under lighting designed to reveal their beauty without damaging their fragile surfaces, she felt something that was not quite pride, but something adjacent to it. Satisfaction that objects which had been hidden for so long were now accessible to people who could appreciate them fully. Dr. Chen's email concluded with an invitation. The museum was hosting a symposium about the collection in 6 months, and they wanted Marina to participate, to speak about the discovery from her perspective. Marina's first instinct was to decline, uncomfortable with the idea of being displayed alongside the artifacts, but she forced herself to sit with the invitation rather than responding immediately. She thought about the women who came to the foundation, about how often their stories remained invisible, contained within paperwork and case files. She thought about Sofia, about what it might mean for her daughter to see Marina speak publicly about their experience. And she thought about the version of herself who had sat in that auction hall, invisible to everyone present, making a choice that had seemed foolish, but had been guided by instincts worth trusting. She replied to Dr. Chen accepting the invitation, adding that she would need help preparing, that public speaking was not something she had experience with, that she was uncertain what she could contribute to an academic symposium. Dr. Chen's response came quickly, assuring her that her perspective was exactly what was needed, that the human story behind the discovery mattered as much as the scholarly analysis of the artifacts themselves. The months leading up to the symposium passed in a blur of foundation work, parenting, and preparation that felt alternately exciting and terrifying. Marina worked with a speaking coach who helped her organize her thoughts, who taught her that vulnerability was not weakness when shared with intention. She wrote and rewrote her remarks, trying to capture the experience honestly, without either minimizing its difficulty or exploiting it for dramatic effect. Sofia became involved in the preparation, asking Marina questions that prompted deeper reflection, offering feedback on drafts that was surprisingly incisive. Her daughter had inherited or developed a directness that cut through the careful language Marina sometimes hid behind, pushing her to be more honest than comfortable. In those conversations, Marina saw evidence that their experience had shaped Sofia in ways that extended beyond trauma, that it had also given her tools for recognizing authenticity and calling out pretense. The trip to Athens was Sofia's first time leaving the country, and Marina watched her daughter experience the city with the intensity of someone encountering history she had only read about. They visited the Acropolis, walked through museums whose collections spanned millennia, ate food that tasted different from anything Sofia had encountered before. The journey felt like a celebration, not just of the discovery, but of having survived to reach a point where such experiences were possible. The symposium itself was held in a lecture hall whose formal architecture made Marina's hands sweat as she waited backstage. She could hear the audience arriving, could feel the weight of expectation settling around her. Dr. Chen appeared beside her, offering water and reassurance, reminding Marina that she had earned the right to be there, that her story was part of the collection's history. When Marina finally walked onto the stage, she forced herself to look out at the audience rather than at her notes. Academics sat alongside journalists, museum administrators, and members of the Greek cultural ministry. And scattered among them were faces she recognized from the foundation, women who had made the journey to Athens because they wanted to witness this moment, to see someone who had started where they were standing in a place they could barely imagine reaching. Marina began by describing the auction, the feeling of sitting in that back row with Sofia, the sound of the auctioneer's voice as lot after lot disappeared to bidders who belonged there in ways she did not. She talked about raising her hand, about the judgment she felt in the room's sudden attention, about signing papers without fully understanding what she was committing to. She described the first trip to the ship, the descent into darkness, the moment when the flashlight beam revealed objects that did not belong in a derelict wreck. She talked about the doubt that followed, about the mockery from family and community, about the nights when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake that would accelerate rather than prevent their downfall. And she talked about persistence, about the choice to keep looking even when others insisted she was wasting time, about the importance of having one person, in her case Sofia, who believed that what she had found mattered. She talked about Dr. Chen's team arriving, about the systematic exploration that revealed the cargo hold's contents, about the moment when she understood that the discovery was real and significant. But she also talked about what came after, about the complexity of claiming ownership, about the legal processes that transformed sudden wealth into something actually accessible. She talked about learning to trust people again after months of having her judgment questioned, about building the foundation as a way of honoring the desperation that had driven her to that auction hall. She concluded by saying that the icons had given her more than money. They had given her proof that value was not always obvious, that what society dismissed might contain significance that required different eyes to recognize. She said she hoped the exhibition would remind people to look more carefully at what they encountered, to question assumptions about worth, to resist the impulse to judge too quickly what others chose to pursue. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, and Marina felt something release in her chest, a tension she had been carrying since the first moment someone had laughed at her purchase. Vindication had arrived in many forms over the past 2 years, but this felt different. Recognition not just of what she had found, but of the journey that had brought her to the discovery. The reception afterward was crowded with people wanting to speak with her, to ask questions, to share their own stories of dismissal and persistence. Marina navigated these conversations with a grace she had not known she possessed, discovering that her experience had given her vocabulary for connecting with others who felt marginalized by systems that measured value too narrowly. One conversation stayed with her long after the evening ended. A graduate student approached hesitantly, introducing herself as someone whose research focused on Byzantine trade networks. She said Marina's discovery had transformed her field, that the artifacts were providing evidence for theories that had been speculative until now. But she also said that Marina's story had transformed her personally, had given her courage to pursue research directions her advisors considered risky. She said she had been on the verge of abandoning a project she believed in because senior scholars kept telling her the evidence was not there, that she was wasting time on a question that could not be answered. Marina's discovery had proved that evidence could be waiting in unexpected places, that sometimes the reason something had not been found was simply that people had not looked where they should. Marina thanked her for sharing that, struck by the idea that the impact of her discovery extended beyond the artifacts themselves, that it was influencing how people thought about research and risk and the value of pursuing questions others dismissed. It suggested that the story's meaning was still being written, that its significance would continue unfolding in ways she could not predict or control. The flight home gave Marina time to process everything that had happened in Athens. Sofia slept beside her, exhausted by travel and excitement. And Marina watched clouds pass beneath the plane while thinking about the symposium, about the connections she had made, about the ways the discovery continued to reshape her understanding of what was possible. She thought about the women at the foundation, about Rachel and all the others, who carried their own versions of the desperation Marina remembered so clearly. She thought about the graduate student whose research had been validated, about the scholars studying the icons, about the visitors who would stand before the artifacts and see beauty without knowing the full story of how they had been found. And she thought about the ship, dissolved now into memory and documentation, its physical form gone, but its impact still radiating outward through channels that would continue branching long after Marina herself was gone. The discovery had changed her life absolutely, but it had also become something larger than her personal story, a reminder that value could be hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone desperate or brave enough to look where others had decided nothing worth finding could exist. When they landed, Sofia woke disoriented, asking where they were, and Marina told her they were home. The word felt true in ways it had not during the months above the laundromat, when home had been something temporary, contingent, always at risk of being taken away. Now it meant something solid, a foundation that could support not just their immediate needs, but the future Sofia was growing into. They collected their luggage and walked through the terminal, and Marina felt the familiar weight of ordinary life settling back around her shoulders. Tomorrow she would return to the foundation, to meetings and applications and decisions about disbursements. Sofia would go back to school, to homework and friendships, and the gradually unfolding drama of adolescence. The discovery would recede slightly, becoming part of their history rather than their present, though its impact would continue shaping choices they had not yet made. As they drove home through streets Marina had once walked when she could not afford gas, she felt gratitude for the transformation that had carried them from that auction hall to Athens and back, for the stubbornness that had kept her looking when everyone insisted she should stop, for the daughter who had believed in a ship that looked like a fantasy but had been real. The icons were scattered across museums now, their beauty and historical significance recognized by people who devoted their lives to understanding such things. But Marina knew that their most important work had already been done, in the moment when they proved that dismissal was not destiny, that value existed beyond what markets immediately recognized, that hope was not foolishness, but sometimes the most rational response to a world that measured worth too narrowly. She pulled into the driveway of their house, where lights were on timers that created the illusion of presence even when they were gone. Sofia unbuckled her seatbelt and gathered her things, already talking about what she would tell her friends about the trip, about the Acropolis and the symposium and the food they had eaten. Marina followed her inside, carrying luggage and memories and the knowledge that they had survived not just poverty, but the judgment that came with it, that they had emerged on the other side changed, but intact, stronger for having been tested by circumstances that might have broken them. The house welcomed them back with familiar silence, and Marina moved through rooms that still felt new enough to inspire gratitude each time she entered them. Later, after Sofia was asleep and Marina was alone with her thoughts, she walked to the study where the two original panels hung on the wall. She looked at them in lamplight, at faces rendered with devotion that had survived a millennium, and felt connected across time to the artists who had created them, to the people who had valued them enough to transport them across dangerous waters, to all the hands that had touched them during their long journey from sacred spaces to salt water to climate-controlled walls. The ship was gone, The icons were scattered, but the story they told remained, written in changed lives and inspired research, and hope that had been tested and proven resilient. Marina turned off the light and walked to bed, carrying with her the certainty that she had honored the discovery not just by claiming it, but by using it to create pathways for others who faced the same dismissal she had endured. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities. The Foundation would continue its work. Sofia would continue growing, and Marina would continue learning how to inhabit a life she had not expected. Grateful for the ship that had been dismissed by everyone except the one person desperate enough to see its potential, brave enough to claim it, despite the mockery, stubborn enough to prove that sometimes the most valuable discoveries come not to those who know what they are looking for, but to those who refuse to stop looking, even when others insist there is nothing left to find. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.